Welcome, dear listener. Tonight we drift far back in time, to an age of marble temples, restless warriors, and dreams of conquest. This is the story of Alexander of Macedon, remembered as Alexander the Great. But here, we will not rush through battles or speak in shouts of glory. Instead, we will walk slowly through his world, step by step, as if strolling along quiet roads that once stretched across an empire. So close your eyes, rest your mind, and let the story carry you gently into sleep. The story of Alexander begins not with the boy himself, but with the world that awaited him. To understand the life he would live and the empire he would shape, we must first picture the lands of Greece before his birth. In the centuries before Alexander, Greece was a collection of proud city-states. Each city was its own small world, a polis, as the Greeks called it, with its own laws, its own festivals, and its own way of life. There was Athens, bright with philosophers, artists, and the echoes of democracy. There was Sparta, disciplined and severe, where boys were trained from childhood to become soldiers. There was Thebes, rising and falling in power, and Corinth, whose merchants sailed the seas with goods from every corner of the Mediterranean. These cities were bound together by language, by religion, and by a shared admiration for stories of the gods. Yet they were also divided by rivalry and pride. No city wished to bow to another. The greatest test of this independence had come during the Persian Wars, when mighty kings from Asia had sought to conquer Greece. In those times the cities had joined together, at least for a while, and their unity had saved them. The battles of Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea had given the Greeks pride and the belief that freedom was their destiny. But once the Persian threat faded, the old rivalries returned. The strongest of the city-states, Athens and Sparta, soon turned against one another in what became known as the Peloponnesian War. It was a long and bitter struggle, nearly 30 years of sieges, naval battles and betrayals. Athens, with its empire of islands and ships, believed itself unshakable. Sparta, with its armies of iron-willed warriors, believed itself unstoppable. When the war ended, Athens was humbled. Its golden age, with its plays, its philosophy, and its great building projects like the Parthenon, dimmed under the shadow of defeat. Sparta claimed victory, but the victory was hollow. Its people were few in number, and the years of war had drained their strength. Soon other cities, Thebes, Corinth, and smaller powers, rose in the endless struggle for control. By the time the dust settled, Greece was weary. Its cities remained proud, but none of them strong enough to dominate the rest. A sense of fragility hung in the air, as though the greatness of Greece was something of the past, not of the future. And it was in this weary, fractured land that a new force began to stir, not from Athens, not from Sparta, not from Thebes, but from the rugged hills of Macedonia to the north. To the Greeks of Athens or Sparta, Macedonia was once little more than a distant land of rough-speaking tribes. They thought of it as a frontier, a place of forests, mountains, and horse breeders. Its people were hardy and strong, but to the southern Greeks they seemed uncultured, not polished in philosophy or the arts. For generations Macedonia had been overlooked, a shadow beyond the main stage of Greek history. Yet Macedonia held certain advantages that the proud city-states did not. It had wide plains for raising horses, forests for timber, and strong mountain passes that protected it from invasion. Its kings, though often struggling to hold power among rival nobles, were skilled in the art of survival. They balanced diplomacy with force, learning to bend or strike as the times required. The true turning point came with King Philip II. Philip had once been a hostage in Thebes, where he watched and learned the methods of Greek warfare. When he returned to Macedonia, he carried with him new ideas. He saw how the famous Theban general Epaminondas had reshaped the battlefield with disciplined formations and deep ranks of soldiers. Philip decided he would do the same, but on an even greater scale. Philip took the Macedonian army, once a loose gathering of warriors, and forged it into something new. He trained his men to fight as one, shoulder to shoulder, with long spears called sarissas, far longer than the spears of the Greeks. These weapons allowed his soldiers to form a bristling wall of points, advancing slowly, but with unstoppable pressure. Behind this wall, cavalry waited, ready to charge when the enemy faltered. This new army was not only powerful, but also loyal, for Philip rewarded his men with land and wealth. In return, they gave him their strength and their trust. Battle by battle, year by year, Philip extended his reach. He defeated enemies to the north and west, secured Macedonia's borders, and then turned his eyes toward Greece itself. The city-states, divided as always, could not resist him. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, Philip's army crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. Among Philip's soldiers that day was his young son, Alexander, who fought bravely and showed the first sparks of the leader he would one day become. After Chaeronea, Greece lay at Philip's feet. Yet he did not destroy it. Instead, he sought to unite it, not out of kindness, but out of ambition. He dreamed of leading a grand campaign against Persia, the old enemy that had once threatened Greece. With the city-states bound to him by force and treaty, Philip prepared for the greatest war of his time, but before he could march east, fate struck. In 336 BCE, at the height of his power, Philip II was murdered during a festival. The reasons remain uncertain, perhaps jealousy, perhaps conspiracy, but the effect was clear. The throne of Macedonia passed not to an old and seasoned man, but to a youth of just 20 years, Alexander, the son of Philip and Queen Olympias. The world that Alexander inherited was unlike the one his father had known. Macedonia was now a true power. Greece was subdued, Persia stood waiting across the sea, and at the center of it all, a young king prepared to step into history. Though the armies and politics shaped the surface of the world, beneath them flowed the deeper currents of culture, myth, and belief. Greece in the mid-4th century BCE was still a land rich in ideas. In Athens, men still gathered in shaded courtyards to listen to philosophers discuss virtue, justice, and the nature of the soul. Plato had written of his republic, imagining a world ruled by wisdom. Aristotle, younger but no less brilliant, was teaching his pupils to study the natural world, to look closely at plants, animals, and the stars above. Even as Athens had lost its empire, its voice in philosophy and learning still echoed across the Mediterranean. Theatres still opened their stages to tragedies and comedies, where citizens sat in rows carved from stone, listening to stories of gods and kings. Temples still rose in marble splendor, their columns white against the blue sky, their altars heavy with offerings of incense and wine. In the countryside, farmers still worked the soil with wooden plows, just as their fathers and grandfathers had done, drawing life from the earth. In Sparta, life remained severe, but its spirit was fading. Once, Spartan warriors had been feared across Greece, their discipline unmatched, but the long years of war and the smallness of their numbers left them weakened. A shadow of their former glory lingered, but little more. Thebes, proud of its victory over Sparta years before, now found itself subdued by Philip's hand. Corinth and the other cities, weary of endless struggles, bent to the Macedonian king. The freedom the Greeks had once cherished was not gone, but it was bound in chains of necessity. And so the land into which Alexander was born was one of contrasts, still rich in beauty and thought, but weary from war and division. The old powers of Greece looked backward, toward what had been. Macedonia looked forward, toward what might be. It was in the city of Pella, the Macedonian capital, that Alexander entered the world in 356 BC. His birth was wrapped in omens and stories. It was said that on the very night he was born, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the wonders of the world, was set aflame. The priests whispered that this was no accident, but a sign, for as the temple of the goddess burned, a child had come into the world who would one day set Asia itself alight. His mother Olympias was a proud and intense woman from the royal line of Epirus, a land of mountains and ancient rituals. She believed her son was destined for greatness, perhaps even touched by the gods themselves. She filled his childhood with tales of Achilles, the hero of Troy, and of Heracles, the son of Zeus. From his earliest days, Alexander grew with the sense that he was not merely a prince but something more, someone chosen, someone meant to step beyond the ordinary. The land was ready for such a figure. Greece, exhausted yet still filled with brilliance, needed new energy to carry it forward. Macedonia, strengthened under Philip, needed a leader bold enough to take the next step. Persia, vast and wealthy, loomed across the sea, its kings ruling from grand palaces, its empire stretching over countless peoples. In this moment, balanced between decline and possibility, Alexander's story began. He was born into a world that was fractured, but waiting. A world that would, in only a few decades, be transformed by his ambition, his brilliance, and his restless desire to go ever further. The story of Alexander's childhood begins even before his first breath, wrapped in whispers of destiny. In the summer of 356 BCE, in the royal palace at Pella, Queen Olympias gave birth to her son. The night sky, they said, was restless with signs. Legends tell us that on that very night, far away in Asia Minor, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus caught fire. To the people of the ancient world, flames were never just flames, they were messengers. Priests murmured that this fire marked the arrival of a soul who would one day change the world, a soul destined to blaze across history like a torch in the dark. Olympias herself believed her child was touched by the divine. She came from Epirus, a land of mountains and old rituals, where the worship of ancient gods was strong, fierce and deeply religious. She filled Alexander's young life with tales of heroes and omens. To her, Alexander was no ordinary prince. She told him he was a descendant of Achilles, the swift-footed hero of Troy, and even of Heracles, the son of Zeus. From his earliest days, the boy was raised to believe that greatness was not just possible, but inevitable. His father, Philip II, saw matters differently. A warrior king and strategist, Philip valued strength, courage, and discipline above all. Where Olympias gave Alexander dreams of divine ancestry, Philip sought to teach him the reality of kingship. For Philip, Alexander was a future general, a future king, a boy who must learn to command men, to ride horses, and to understand the art of war. This balance between his mother's visions and his father's lessons shaped Alexander's childhood. In Olympias, he learned passion and belief. In Philip, he learned strategy and power. It was a strange mix, but it gave rise to the restless determination that would guide him all his life. The palace at Pella, where Alexander grew, was not like the grand marble buildings of Athens. It was simpler, but alive with activity. Courtyards rang with the sound of horses' hooves, soldiers coming and going, and messengers rushing with news from the frontiers. For Alexander, this was home, a place of constant movement, where war and politics were daily concerns, and where the future seemed always uncertain. As a boy, Alexander listened eagerly to the stories told around him. Soldiers spoke of distant lands, of Persia's wealth, of battles and victories. Priests spoke of omens and gods, of sacrifices and ancient rituals. At night, under the flickering light of oil lamps, Olympias whispered to him of heroes long gone, urging him to follow in their footsteps. Thus began the childhood of Alexander, a childhood heavy with expectation, filled with symbols of destiny, and shaped by two powerful parents whose influence would never leave him. The royal palace at Pella was the heart of Macedonia. Unlike the polished marble temples of Athens, Pella's strength was in its energy. Its halls were not quiet places of philosophy, but bustling centers of command. Courtyards echoed with the sounds of armor clattering, horses neighing, and the voices of soldiers waiting for orders. Messengers hurried in and out with scrolls tied in leather cords, carrying news from distant borders. For a young prince like Alexander, this was both a home and a school. From his earliest years he was surrounded not by stillness, but by the rhythm of kingship. He saw his father holding council with generals, studying maps spread across wooden tables, planning campaigns that stretched across mountains and seas. He saw guests from other lands, emissaries dressed in foreign robes, arriving with gifts or demands. He saw that to be king was to live in a world of constant motion, of choices that could change the fate of nations. Yet, even in this busy world, Alexander still had the days of childhood. In the gardens of Pella, he learnt to run, to climb, to play at games with other boys of noble families. But his toys were not simple. They were often miniature versions of real weapons, small spears, wooden shields, bows made for practice. From the start, a Macedonian prince was expected to learn the arts of war. His tutors oversaw his earliest lessons. He learnt to read and write in Greek, the language of culture and diplomacy. Though Macedonian was still spoken in the countryside, he read stories of Homer, of the great heroes of Troy. Each line of poetry carried weight, for these were not merely tales, they were guides for life. Achilles, the unmatched warrior of the Iliad, became a figure Alexander admired above all others. Training in the use of weapons began young. Wooden swords were replaced by iron ones as he grew stronger. Archery practice filled the afternoons, arrows striking straw targets set in the courtyard. Wrestling was taught too, for strength and skill with the body were as important as skill with the sword. Horses were central to Macedonian life, and Alexander, like all boys of noble birth, learned to ride before he was tall enough to hold the reins with ease. The palace stables became one of his favorite places. There, among the smell of hay and leather, he learned the ways of animals that would later carry him into battle. Horses were not just beasts of burden in Macedonia, they were companions in war, extensions of the warrior himself. A strong horse could decide the outcome of a battle, and for Alexander, the bond with horses was deep from the beginning. But education was not only about strength. Macedonia's kings understood that wisdom was needed to rule as much as courage. Alexander was surrounded by conversations on politics, by debates among older men about law, alliances, and strategy. Though still a boy, he listened with sharp attention, remembering details, absorbing ideas. It was clear, even in those early years, that Alexander was different. Where other boys tired, he remained focused. Where others saw only games, he saw lessons. The mix of play and training in Pella formed the foundation of his character. Restless, curious, ambitious, he was still a child, yet the weight of expectation was already pressing upon him. The whispers of destiny his mother spoke, and the demands of discipline his father required, met in the young boy. It was as if two forces, Passion and reason, fire and steel, were shaping him together into something greater than either parent had imagined. No story of Alexander's childhood can be told without speaking of his parents, for the boy was shaped as much by their rivalry as by their love. Queen Olympias and King Philip II were two of the strongest figures of their age, yet utterly different in nature. Between them, Alexander's early years became a training ground of fire and contradiction. Olympias was not a queen who remained in the shadows. She came from Epirus, a land of mountains where old traditions lingered, and where the worship of Dionysus, the god of ecstasy and transformation, was fierce. From her homeland she brought not only noble blood, but also a passion for the divine. She believed deeply in omens, in dreams, in the hidden signs of the gods. To her Alexander was chosen, a child set apart. She told him stories of Achilles, of the heroes who stood above ordinary men, and reminded him again and again that he carried their blood. Olympias was protective, but also demanding. She filled Alexander's imagination with visions of glory, of deeds so great that poets would one day sing of them. In her presence he felt destined, lifted by her fiery spirit. Yet this intensity also made him restless, eager to prove himself worthy of her belief. Philip II, on the other hand, was practical and stern, a warrior through and through. He believed greatness was forged in discipline, not in dreams. He was a man who had built an empire out of a kingdom once considered weak, and he did so not through prophecy, but through strategy, steel, and the loyalty of soldiers. From Philip, Alexander learned the realities of power. His father taught him that men follow strength, not visions, that armies move by discipline, not by chance. When Alexander watched Philip lead councils or march at the head of his troops, he saw what it meant to be a king not in words but in action. Yet the relationship between father and son was never simple. Philip, surrounded by generals and companions, was sometimes distant. He had many wives and many children, and though Alexander was the son of a queen, he was also one among others in a court filled with rivalries. Olympias resented Philip's other marriages, and Alexander often felt caught in their conflicts. Still, there were moments of closeness. Philip recognized the spark in his son. He took pride in Alexander's quick mind and sharp courage. Stories tell us that when the boy tamed the wild horse Bucephalus, Philip's eyes filled with tears, and he declared, "My son, you must find a kingdom great enough for your ambitions, for Macedonia is too small for you." Whether these exact words were spoken, no one can say, but they capture the truth of their bond. Philip saw in Alexander something that could not be confined. Between Olympia's fiery faith and Philip's iron discipline, Alexander grew into a boy who carried both dream and reality within him. His mother gave him the belief that he was destined for greatness. His father gave him the tools to make that greatness possible. And though their quarrels and rivalries would one day drive him into difficult choices, their influence was the foundation of all that he became. As Alexander grew older, his education deepened. Philip II, though a man of war, understood that wisdom was as important as strength, and so he sought a teacher worthy of his son. He chose one of the greatest minds of Greece, Aristotle, the student of Plato, a philosopher whose works would shape thought for centuries to come. Aristotle came to Macedonia to guide the prince and his companions. Under his care, Alexander's world widened. The philosopher led his students not only through words, but through exploration. Together they studied plants, animals, the patterns of the stars. They read poetry and plays, learning how stories could shape the mind. They spoke of ethics, of justice, of the duties of kings. For Alexander, the lessons of Homer were most beloved. He carried a copy of the Iliad, said to have been annotated by Aristotle himself, and kept it close for the rest of his life. In Achilles, he saw the model of the warrior he longed to be, bold, swift, honored by all. Yet Aristotle also reminded him that even the greatest heroes were flawed, and that wisdom must temper passion. Education was not confined to scrolls and discussions. Alexander's training continued in the fields and the barracks. He rode horses with growing skill, his movements smooth and confident. He practiced with sword and spear until the weapons felt like extensions of his own body. Wrestling, running and hunting hardened his muscles and taught him endurance. It was during these years that one of the most famous stories of his youth unfolded: the taming of Bucephalus. The great black horse had been brought to Philip, but none of the men could ride him. The animal reared and fought, too wild for any rider. The court murmured that he was useless. Yet Alexander, still a boy, stepped forward. He had noticed something the others had missed. The horse was frightened of his own shadow. Gently, Alexander turned Bucephalus toward the sun, so that the shadow lay behind. He spoke softly, calming the animal, and then leapt onto his back. The horse galloped, but Alexander held fast, guiding him with steady hands. When he returned, the crowd erupted with astonishment. Philip is said to have embraced his son, declaring that Macedonia was too small a stage for him. This moment, whether embellished by time or not, became a symbol of Alexander's character: keen observation, courage, and a determination to succeed where others failed. By the time Alexander was a young man, he had grown into more than just a prince. He was already a figure who inspired admiration. Among his companions, he was respected for his sharp mind and bold spirit. Among soldiers, he was known as the son of their king, already showing the steel of leadership. The foundations of his future were set. A boy raised between prophecy and discipline, between the fire of his mother and the strategy of his father, shaped by philosophy, poetry, and the rigors of war. The Prince of Macedonia was ready to step into a larger world, though neither he nor his people yet knew how far his path would carry him. By the time Alexander reached his teenage years, the rhythms of his life had already set him apart from ordinary boys. While others his age still played at games, Alexander was being prepared for command. In Macedonia, sons of nobles were expected to ride with the king, to serve as companions in war, and Alexander, as the heir, was placed at the very center of this demanding world. Philip II's reign was one of constant movement. Campaigns stretched north against Illyrian tribes, east into Thrace, and south into the fractured politics of Greece. Each year seemed to bring another war, another fortress to besiege, another region to subdue. For Alexander, this was no distant tale. He rode beside his father, saw the dust rise from marching armies, and heard the shouts of men as they clashed in the field. It is said that even in his earliest battles, Alexander showed not only bravery, but also the sharp eye of a commander. He studied the way Philip arranged his men, how the phalanx advanced as one, the forest of sarissas tilting forward like a moving wall. He saw how cavalry was held in reserve, waiting for the right moment to strike. These were not just lessons in war, but in patience, timing, and control, qualities that would later define his own generalship. The first true test of Alexander's courage came in 340 BCE, when Philip campaigned against Byzantium. Though still a youth, Alexander was entrusted with responsibility at home. Left as regent of Macedonia, he ruled in his father's absence. When a Thracian tribe rebelled, Alexander gathered the army and marched against them. He defeated the uprising swiftly, showing not only courage but the ability to act decisively, as a king would. For the soldiers who followed him, this was a sign: the prince was no child, but a leader already. This early success marked Alexander's path. No longer seen as only the son of Philip and Olympias, he began to stand on his own. His name was carried with respect through the camps, whispered among the men, as one who would one day take the mantle of his father. But perhaps the most famous of Alexander's early experiences came 2 years later, at the Battle of Chaeronea. In 338 BCE, Philip faced the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, who had risen in resistance against Macedonian power. It was a battle that would decide the fate of Greece itself. On that day, Alexander, only 18 years old, commanded the left wing of his father's army. It was an enormous responsibility, for he faced the Theban sacred band, a force of hardened soldiers famed across Greece for their valor. As the battle raged, Alexander led a cavalry charge that broke through the Theban lines. The sacred band fought bravely to the last man, but they were cut down, their ranks shattered. The victory at Chaeronea was complete, and Alexander's role in it was remembered with awe. For the Greeks, Chaeronea meant the end of their independence. For Macedonia, it meant supremacy. And for Alexander, it meant that he had proven himself, not in games or in training, but in the true test of war. The Battle of Chaeronea was more than just a military victory. It was the moment when Alexander stepped out of his father's shadow and was seen as a warrior in his own right. Though Philip had been the architect of the triumph, those who fought that day could not forget the sight of the young prince charging at the head of his cavalry, fearless against men twice his age. After Chaeronea, the Greeks were forced into alliance with Macedonia. Philip created what was known as the Corinthian League, binding Athens, Thebes, and the other city-states into a fragile union under his leadership. In these councils, Alexander sat beside his father, listening closely to the debates of older men. Though still in his teens, he was learning not only how to fight, but how to rule, how to persuade allies, how to temper force with diplomacy, and how to hold power without crushing those who opposed it. For Philip, this was the peak of his power. Yet for Alexander, it was the beginning of his apprenticeship in leadership. He began to accompany his father more often, riding at his side in councils and on campaigns. Soldiers who once looked at him as a boy now greeted him with respect, for they had seen his courage in battle. Still, life in the royal court was never without danger. Philip's growing power brought not only admiration but resentment. Rivals whispered, nobles plotted, and Olympias often clashed with her husband. Alexander, caught between his parents, had to tread carefully, At times he sided with his mother, defending her honor against Philip's other wives. At other times, he showed loyalty to his father, eager to prove his worth as heir. This tension sharpened his mind and taught him caution, skills as valuable as any weapon on the battlefield. Despite these challenges, Alexander's reputation continued to rise. He trained daily, pushing his body to endure long marches, harsh weather, and the weight of armor. He studied maps and histories, questioning his teachers about lands far beyond Macedonia's borders. Persia, vast and distant, was often spoken of. The thought of conquering such an empire stirred something within him, a restless desire to go further than any Macedonian had gone before. The army, too, felt his growing presence. Alexander did not hold himself apart from the men. He spoke to them, learned their names, shared in their hardships. This bond would become one of his greatest strengths as a commander, the trust between leader and soldier. Already, as a youth, he was sowing the seeds of loyalty that would carry him through years of war to come. Though the campaigns of these years were his father's, Alexander's role within them grew steadily larger. Each success, each small command entrusted to him, strengthened his confidence and honed his skill. He was no longer just the prince who tamed a wild horse, or the boy who read Homer by lamplight. He was becoming the warrior who would one day lead armies across continents. If the battlefield sharpened Alexander's courage, the royal court tested his patience. Life in Pella was as dangerous in politics as it was in war. Philip's growing power brought not only allies but jealous rivals, and the question of succession was never far from men's minds. Alexander, though the son of Philip and Olympias, was not the only potential heir. Philip had taken other wives, forging alliances through marriage. Each union created new possibilities, new children, and new claims to the throne. Olympias, fierce and proud, was determined that her son would not be overshadowed. She pressed Alexander forward, urging him to remain vigilant, reminding him that kingship was never secure, even for those born to it. The tensions grew sharper after Philip's marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman. At the wedding feast, one of Philip's companions drunkenly declared that now, at last, the king might have a true Macedonian heir. The words cut deep, for they implied that Alexander, born of Olympias from Epirus, was less than fully Macedonian. Enraged, Alexander hurled his cup and shouted back. A heated quarrel followed, and in the chaos, Alexander and Olympias withdrew from the court for a time. This incident revealed the fragile nature of succession. Though Alexander was the eldest son and had already proven himself in battle, envy and politics threatened his claim. He learned then that the throne was not a gift, but a prize that must be defended. Yet Philip could not deny his son's talents. The army respected Alexander. The nobles, though wary, could not ignore his courage. Slowly, the rift between father and son healed, though never fully. Alexander returned to Pella, and once again stood beside Philip in campaigns. But the memory of the insult lingered, and so did the awareness that his future was not guaranteed. These struggles hardened Alexander. He became watchful, quick to sense insult, unwilling to let others diminish his standing. At the same time, he grew more determined to prove himself not just as Philip's son, but as a leader in his own right. If rivals questioned his blood, he would answer with deeds. If they doubted his worth, he would answer with victories. The court may have been filled with whispers and schemes, but the army remained loyal to courage and skill. And in both, Alexander never failed. His place as heir might be threatened in words, but on the field of battle his claim grew stronger with each success. As the years passed, Macedonia's strength only grew. Philip's armies pushed ever outward, subduing tribes to the north and securing Greece to the south. By the late 330s BCE, his gaze turned eastward, across the Aegean Sea. There, stretching vast and rich, lay the Persian Empire. It was the greatest power of the age, an empire of countless peoples, fertile lands and magnificent cities. To the Greeks, Persia was both enemy and prize, remembered for the invasions of Darius and Xerxes, remembered too for its wealth beyond imagining. Philip's dream was to unite the Greeks under his command and lead them against Persia. The Corinthian League, with its uneasy alliance of city-states, was the first step. Already preparations were underway. Armies were being gathered, supplies counted, and strategies drawn. For Philip, Persia was to be the crowning achievement of his reign, the campaign that would carve his name into history. And for Alexander, the prospect stirred restless excitement. All his life he had been fed stories of heroes, of Achilles at Troy, of Hercules on his labors, of Theseus and Jason on their quests. Now the chance seemed near for him to step into their company. The thought of Persia, with its vast fields, its high palaces, its ancient kings, burned like a beacon before him. Yet fate would not allow Philip to see his vision fulfilled. In 336 BCE, As he prepared for the grand campaign, Philip was struck down. During a festival at Agae, where nobles and soldiers gathered, he was assassinated. The reasons remain uncertain, perhaps a personal quarrel, perhaps a deeper plot, but the effect was certain. The great king was gone, and with him, the steady hand that had guided Macedonia's rise. In that moment, all eyes turned to Alexander. He was only 20 years old, but already a seasoned warrior, already a leader who had shown his worth in battle and in command. The throne of Macedonia, heavy with both power and danger, now rested on his shoulders. The court erupted with uncertainty. Rivals whispered, enemies circled, and even some allies hesitated. But Alexander acted swiftly. He secured the loyalty of the army, the very heart of Macedonia's strength. He moved against threats with speed and firmness, leaving no doubt of his authority. Within weeks, the throne was his beyond challenge. Thus ended the years of apprenticeship. The boy who had grown in the palace at Pella, who had studied under Aristotle, who had fought at Charonea, was now king. The young warrior was no longer simply preparing for greatness. He was stepping directly into it. And though Philip had not lived to see it, the dream of Persia had not died with him. It now belonged to Alexander. The campaign that had been his father's ambition would soon become the stage on which the son would earn his name, not just Alexander of Macedon, but Alexander the Great. The death of Philip II sent ripples of shock through Macedonia and across Greece. The great king who had bound the fractured city-states into uneasy unity was gone, struck down in a moment of violence at the height of his power. In his place stood a youth, just 20 years old, with the weight of a kingdom suddenly upon his shoulders. For Alexander, the crown was no gentle gift. It came surrounded by doubt, danger, and expectation. Macedonia was a kingdom of warriors, and its throne was never secure. Rival claimants stirred, some whispering that a boy could not hold what Philip had built. Nobles and generals measured their loyalty carefully, watching to see if the young king could command them. Enemies beyond the borders sharpened their knives, thinking Macedonia might now be vulnerable. Yet Alexander did not hesitate. In the first days of his reign, he moved with the swiftness and certainty of a man far older than his years. His first task was to secure the loyalty of the army, for the Macedonian throne rested more on the trust of soldiers than on any crown of gold. Standing before them, he spoke not as an untested youth, but as a comrade who had already fought at their side. He reminded them of Charonea, of the battles where he had charged with them. He promised them victories yet to come. The army answered with cheers, their voices ringing in unison, pledging their loyalty to him. With the army behind him, Alexander turned to the court. He acted swiftly against rivals, removing those who threatened his position. Some were exiled, others executed. Their plots ended before they could take root. It was a harsh beginning, but a necessary one. In Macedonia, hesitation meant death, and Alexander knew it. Olympias, his mother, stood close beside him in these days. Fierce and protective, she supported her son with every breath. Though her own ambitions sometimes brought tension, still, her presence strengthened his claim, reminding the court that Alexander was not alone. Beyond Macedonia, the world watched closely. In Greece, city-states that had bowed to Philip now wondered if they might regain their freedom. In Athens, voices rose calling for independence. In Thebes, men whispered of rebellion. Across the Aegean, Persia observed carefully, for the new king was young, and youth was often seen as weakness. But Alexander was determined to show that weakness was not in him. He would prove, from the very first steps of his reign, that he was no boy holding his father's crown, but a king, ready to lead. The news of Philip's death spread quickly, carried by riders across mountain roads and coastal harbours. In Greece, the reaction was immediate. Cities that had bowed reluctantly to Macedonian rule under Philip now stirred with hope. They believed that the death of the old king meant the chains of the Corinthian League might be broken. In Athens, speeches filled the air. Orators reminded the people that freedom had once been theirs, and could be again. In Thebes, leaders whispered of rebellion, seeing an opportunity to strike before the young king could establish his power. Even in distant Thessaly, murmurs of resistance grew. Each city hoped that a boy of 20 could not hold what Philip had taken with years of strategy and war. But Alexander acted with astonishing speed. He gathered his forces and marched south. Winter snows still clung to the mountain passes, yet he pressed on, leading his men through cold and hardship without pause. The suddenness of his movement stunned the Greeks. Where they expected hesitation, they found determination. In Thessaly, he confronted the rebels directly. Standing before them, he offered a choice: loyalty or ruin. His presence, commanding and calm, and the sight of his army at his back, convinced them. Thessaly submitted, its rebellion ending before it could ignite. From there, Alexander moved swiftly to the Isthmus of Corinth. There he called a council of the Greek states, demanding their allegiance to the league his father had formed. Most submitted, their will broken by the memory of Chaeronea and by the certainty that Alexander was not to be underestimated. Even Athens, despite its longing for freedom, bent to the young king's command. Only Thebes resisted. Believing Alexander too far to respond, they rose in open revolt. But Alexander's speed once again proved decisive. He appeared at the gates of Thebes before the city even realized he was near. What followed was a harsh lesson. Thebes was taken by storm, its defenses shattered. The city was destroyed, its people killed or sold into slavery. The message was clear, carved in fire and ruin. Rebellion against Alexander would bring not freedom but annihilation. Across Greece, the effect was immediate. Fear and respect bound the cities once more to Macedon. None doubted again that the young king held his father's strength, and perhaps even more. By the time spring returned, Alexander stood secure as master of Greece. His authority was unquestioned, his command absolute, and with his southern flank subdued, his eyes began to turn eastward, toward the vast empire that lay beyond the sea. Persia awaited, and the dream of conquest that had once belonged to Philip now burned in Alexander's heart. With Greece subdued and the cities bound once more by fear and loyalty, Alexander turned his thoughts to the great prize that had first been his father's dream, Persia. For generations, the empire across the sea had loomed large in Greek memory. It was Persia that had sent mighty armies to burn Athens, Persia that had fought at Marathon, at Thermopylae, at Salamis. Though those invasions had failed, Persia remained vast, wealthy and proud. To conquer it was to achieve more than glory. It was to seize the greatest empire the world had yet known. But such a campaign required careful preparation. Alexander could not simply gather his men and march. He needed ships to cross the sea, supplies to feed thousands, and gold to pay the army. He also needed unity, for the Greeks would not fight willingly unless they believed the war served them too. At Corinth, Alexander met with the League of Greek States. Standing among the leaders of Athens, Corinth, and other cities, he was chosen as commander of the expedition against Persia. The title was more than symbolic. It bound the Greeks, at least in appearance, to his cause. They would fight under his banner, not because they loved Macedon, but because they feared and respected him. Back in Macedonia, he prepared the army. His father had left him a force unlike any other, the Macedonian phalanx, drilled to perfection, their long sarissas bristling like the quills of a porcupine, the companion cavalry, armored horsemen who would become the hammer of his conquests, and light troops, archers and slingers drawn from allied lands. Together they formed a balanced, disciplined machine of war. Supplies were gathered, coin minted, and treaties secured. Alexander also sought to ensure the loyalty of his generals. Many had served under Philip, men older than Alexander himself. To win their trust, he treated them as comrades, sharing in their hardships, listening to their counsel, but always making the final decision himself. Slowly he built not only an army, but a bond, one that would carry them through years of campaigns. Yet even as he prepared, dangers lingered at home. The northern tribes, restless and fierce, threatened Macedonia's borders. Alexander marched against them in a swift campaign, defeating them and securing his rear. No enemy would be left behind him when he set out for Asia. By the spring of 334 BCE, the stage was set. Alexander, only 22 years old, stood at the head of perhaps 40,000 men. They gathered on the shores of the Hellespont, where Europe touched Asia. Behind them lay the familiar lands of Greece and Macedonia. Before them stretched the unknown, the vast dominion of Persia. The moment was heavy with meaning. According to legend, as Alexander prepared to cross, he visited the tomb of Achilles at Troy. There he laid a wreath, and honored the hero he had admired since childhood. Standing at that ancient grave, he whispered that Achilles had been lucky to have Homer to sing of his deeds. Alexander, with quiet determination, resolved that his own deeds would be no less worthy of remembrance. The ships waited, their sails ready to catch the wind. The young king, crowned by fate and sharpened by trial, was about to step into history's grandest stage. The spring air was clear as the Macedonian army gathered on the western shore of the Hellespont. Thousands of men lined the coast, their armor glinting in the sun, their banners snapping in the wind. Behind them lay Europe, their homeland of mountains, valleys, and city-states. Before them, across the narrow strait of water, stretched the vast continent of Asia, the land of Persia, the prize of kings. For Alexander, this was more than a military crossing. It was a moment steeped in symbolism. He was not only leading an army into foreign lands, he was stepping into the role of conqueror, carrying the weight of Greek memory with him. To the Greeks, Persia was the great adversary, remembered for the invasions of Xerxes and Darius, for the burning of Athens, for the endless struggle between East and West. Now, a young king stood ready to reverse that story, to bring Persia itself under Macedonian rule. The fleet of triremes waited, their oarsmen ready. Soldiers boarded in silence, some nervous, others eager, their shields and spears stacked in orderly rows. Horses were led carefully onto transports, stamping at the unfamiliar motion of the sea. The air was thick with anticipation, the knowledge that once they left these shores, there would be no easy return. When the signal was given, the ships pushed off. The oars dipped in unison, carrying the army slowly across the glittering strait. Alexander himself took part in the passage with ceremony. Upon reaching the Asian shore, he leapt to land first, spear in hand, declaring that he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods. It was both an act of ritual and of confidence, a sign to his men that this conquest was destined, not merely planned. In a gesture of piety, Alexander then travelled to the site of ancient Troy. There, among the wind-swept ruins, he offered sacrifices to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, and to the spirits of the heroes who had once fought upon those plains. He laid a wreath on the tomb of Achilles, his childhood hero, and in that solemn place he felt the weight of both history and destiny. To his companions, he spoke softly that he envied Achilles, not for his victories, but for having Homer to sing of them. Alexander's ambition, even then, was clear. He wished for his own deeds to echo across time, to be remembered as more than mortal. With these rituals complete, the army began to march inland. Ahead lay the satrapies of Persia, ruled by governors of the great king Darius III. Ahead lay battles, cities, rivers and deserts, but for now the step had been taken. The boy who had become a king was now a conqueror, his feet upon Asian soil, his gaze fixed firmly east. The crossing of the Hellespont was not a grand battle, but it was the beginning of everything. It marked the threshold between the life Alexander had known and the life he was about to carve out with sword and strategy. From this moment, the world would never be the same. Alexander's crossing into Asia was only the beginning. Landing on foreign soil was symbolic, but it was not enough. To secure his rule at home and prove himself to allies abroad, he needed victory. His army, though disciplined and loyal, looked to him for proof that their young commander could truly lead them against the might of Persia. The Persian Empire stretched wider than any other of its time. From the shores of Asia Minor to the mountains of India, from the deserts of Egypt to the plains of Mesopotamia, it covered countless peoples and lands. Its armies were vast, its wealth immense. To many, the idea of a young Macedonian king defeating such a power seemed folly. The first test came swiftly. Persian satraps, governors of Asia Minor, gathered their forces to meet Alexander near the river Granicus. It was here, on the banks of a winding river, that the two armies faced one another for the first time. Alexander marched with confidence. His army, numbering perhaps 40,000, was small compared to the vast resources Persia could command, but it was seasoned, disciplined, and united. At its heart stood the phalanx, rows of infantry bristling with long spears. Alongside them rode the companion cavalry, Alexander's chosen elite, men who had trained with him for years. Light troops, archers, javelin throwers, and slingers filled the gaps, ready to harass and disrupt the enemy. The Persians, meanwhile, had gathered a strong force, composed of cavalry and Greek mercenaries. They relied on numbers, speed, and the advantage of defending the far bank of the river. For Alexander, the challenge was clear. He would have to cross the rushing water under fire and break their lines. Before the battle, Alexander addressed his men. He reminded them that this was not merely a clash of armies, but the opening of a new chapter in history. The Persians, he said, were wealthy and soft, their soldiers serving kings who lived in luxury. The Macedonians, hardened by years of war, fought not for a distant monarch, but for their own honor and future. His words stirred the army, filling them with determination. As dawn broke, the two sides prepared for combat. The river glistened under the sun, its current strong and cold. On one bank stood the might of Persia, confident in their numbers. On the other stood Alexander, young yet resolute, his helmet shining, his eyes fixed across the water. The first true battle of his great campaign was about to begin. The river Granicus was no mighty torrent. Yet for those who stood upon its banks that day, it was enough to divide worlds. Its waters ran swift and cold, cutting through the rolling fields of Asia Minor. On the far side the Persians waited, cavalry drawn up in glittering ranks, their armor flashing in the morning light, their lances raised and ready. Behind them, mercenary infantry, many of them Greek, stood firm with polished shields and sharp spears. Alexander surveyed the scene with calm intensity. To cross the river meant risk. His men would have to wade through water, their formation broken, while the Persians struck from the higher ground. To wait, however, would invite hesitation, and hesitation was dangerous. A swift blow was needed. one that would not only defeat the Persians, but also send a message across the world that the young Macedonian king was to be feared. He chose boldness. Mounting his horse, Alexander gave the signal. Trumpets sounded, and the companion cavalry, his most trusted warriors, surged forward. They plunged into the river, water splashing high as hooves churned through the current. With them rode Alexander himself, at the very front, spear leveled, golden crest gleaming above his helmet. The Persians charged down to meet them. Lances clashed, horses reared, and the river became a storm of noise and struggle. Men grappled in the shallows, blades flashing, armor slick with water. The sound of shouting filled the air, the cries of men straining against both enemy and current. At first the Persians seemed to hold the advantage. Their position on the bank gave them height, and they pressed hard against the Macedonian riders struggling up from the riverbed. Spears broke, shields splintered, and for a moment the outcome hung in balance. But Alexander would not yield. With his companions around him, he pressed forward again and again. His courage at the front inspired the men, and slowly the tide began to shift. The Macedonians forced their way onto the bank, their spears driving back the Persians. More units crossed behind them, phalanx soldiers pushing through the river to lend their weight to the fight. Then came the turning point. Alexander, still at the thick of the combat, charged directly at a group of Persian nobles. His spear struck true, unhorsing one, then another. In the melee he was nearly killed, his helmet split by a blow, his life saved only by the intervention of a loyal companion, Clytus the Black, who struck down the attacker. This brush with death only heightened Alexander's legend, a king who fought not behind lines, but in the very heart of the battle. With their leaders falling, and their line broken, the Persians began to falter. The Macedonians surged forward, their momentum unstoppable now. One by one, the Persian cavalry gave way, retreating from the riverbank. Behind them the Greek mercenaries who had stood firm found themselves surrounded. Refusing to surrender, they fought desperately, but the phalanx cut them down. The field was soon covered with the fallen. The water of the Granicus stained dark. When the battle ended, the Persian army was shattered. Thousands lay dead, and the road into Asia Minor lay open. For Alexander, it was more than a victory. It was a declaration. The young king had crossed into Asia not as an invader to be driven back, but as a conqueror whose name would now spread in fear and awe. When the noise of battle faded and the last cries drifted away on the wind, the field by the Granicus lay silent. Broken weapons and fallen men marked the riverbank where the two great armies had clashed. The Persians had fled, their governors scattered, their mercenaries slain. The victory was total, and it belonged to Alexander. Yet the work of a conqueror was not finished with the clash of arms. What followed was as important as the fight itself, for victory meant little unless it bound lands and peoples to his cause. The Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia were captured in great numbers. Here Alexander showed a ruthless edge. To him, they were traitors, Greeks who had chosen to fight against their fellow Greeks in service of a foreign king. Many were cut down on the field, and those who survived were sent in chains to hard labor. This act, harsh though it was, sent a clear message to Greece. Loyalty to Persia would not be tolerated. To the cities of Asia Minor, however, Alexander showed a different face. As he marched inland, many towns opened their gates to him. He declared himself the liberator of the Greeks who lived under Persian rule, promising them freedom, self-government, and respect for their traditions. Where resistance arose, he struck quickly and firmly. Where loyalty was shown, he rewarded it with leniency. This careful balance of severity and mercy worked in his favor. Cities that had feared destruction instead found themselves welcomed into his growing sphere of power. Shrines were honored, temples restored, and taxes lightened. The people, long weary of Persian governors, began to see in Alexander not just a conqueror, but a champion of their freedom. The victory at the Granicus also carried weight far beyond Asia Minor. News traveled swiftly back to Greece, carried by ships and messengers. In Athens and Thebes, men heard of the young king's triumph and realized rebellion would bring only ruin. For those who had doubted him, the message was clear. Alexander was no boy to be tested. He had faced Persia in open battle and emerged victorious. Among his own men, the battle strengthened the bond of loyalty. They had seen him charge at the front, risk his life, and fight as one of them. Soldiers do not easily forget such moments. Their trust in him deepened, their willingness to follow him into even greater dangers secured. By the time summer gave way to autumn, Alexander had swept through much of Western Asia Minor. Persian satraps fled before him, their strongholds falling one by one. Step by step, the young king carved a path deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire. But though the first test had been passed, greater challenges still lay ahead. The Persian king himself, Darius III, had not yet stirred. When he did, the battles to come would dwarf the clash at the Granicus. For now, however, Alexander stood triumphant, his first victory secured, his legend already beginning to grow. After the victory at the Granicus, the road through Asia Minor lay open. Alexander did not rush headlong eastward. Instead, he moved carefully, city by city, weaving both fear and loyalty into the fabric of his growing power. The cities along the coast were the first to feel his presence. Some opened their gates willingly, eager to be freed from Persian governors. Others hesitated, weighing their chances. To those who resisted, Alexander showed the sharp edge of conquest. Strongholds that defied him were besieged with relentless precision until their walls fell. Yet once they surrendered, he often spared the people, restoring their laws and religious rights. In this way he gained not only territory, but also gratitude, a conqueror who punished rebellion, but honored loyalty. In Sardis, one of the richest cities of the region, he was welcomed without a fight. The surrender of Sardis was symbolic, for it had long been a Persian stronghold. Alexander entrusted the city to a local governor, promising fair rule and protection. In doing so, he showed that he did not wish to simply destroy Persia's lands, but to inherit and govern them. Farther south, he marched toward Anabasis, a powerful city defended by Persian forces and Greek mercenaries. Here, resistance was fierce. The defenders fought with determination, using the city's strong walls and naval support to hold out. The siege dragged on, marked by assaults, counterattacks, and nights of fire as the walls shook under the clash of engines. In the end, the Persians abandoned the city, retreating by sea. Halicarnassus fell, and with it, another stone of Persia's western defense crumbled. As Alexander advanced, he also began to reorganize the lands he captured. Satraps, local governors, were appointed, some Macedonian, some Greek, and even some local leaders who pledged loyalty to him. This blend of rulers showed his pragmatic mind. He understood that conquest was not only about battles, but about administration. An empire could not be held by force alone. It needed structure, trust, and order. The march through Asia Minor also strengthened the bond between Alexander and his men. He shared their hardships, walking alongside them when the roads grew harsh, eating the same simple meals of bread, olives, and wine. He spoke to them by name, listened to their concerns, and rewarded bravery. Each step made the army not merely his followers, but his companions in destiny. By the end of this campaign, Alexander held control over much of Western Asia Minor. From the Hellespont to the Aegean coast, Persian power had crumbled. Cities now flew Macedonian banners, and temples rang with sacrifices in his honor. Yet for all this progress, the true test was still to come. For in the heart of Persia, Darius III, the great king, was gathering his armies. He would not allow this young Macedonian to march unopposed. Soon, the clash between them would decide not only the fate of Asia Minor, but the course of the ancient world. Alexander, however, did not waver. His eyes remained fixed eastward, across mountains and plains, toward the throne of Persia itself. The campaign had begun, and nothing, not time, not distance, not fear, would turn him back. By the time Alexander secured Asia Minor, the Persian Empire could no longer ignore him. The fall of cities, the loss of satrapies, and the defeat at the Granicus had shaken Persian pride. For the great king Darius III, this was more than an annoyance. It was a threat to the very foundation of his rule. Darius was not the first of Persia's kings to face Greek opposition. His predecessors had marched vast armies into Greece itself, seeking to humble the city-states. Though those invasions had failed, Persia remained mighty, and its wealth stretched across continents. To Darius, the thought of a young Macedonian, barely past 20, carving through his western provinces was intolerable. He resolved to act. From the royal court at Susa, messengers were dispatched across the empire. Orders were carried on swift horses, calling for levies from satraps, for reinforcements from distant lands. Persian nobles gathered their retainers, cavalry from the east rode westward, and contingents from subject peoples, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, and more were drawn together. In time, a great host formed, vast enough to overshadow the small Macedonian force that had crossed into Asia. Alexander, meanwhile, pressed onward. After securing the coast, he moved inland, his eyes fixed on the heart of Persia. But his path soon brought him north, into Cilicia, a narrow land between the mountains and the sea. The roads here were difficult, winding through steep passes where an army might be trapped if not careful. Yet Alexander advanced with determination, driving his men onward despite the hardships. It was in Cilicia that fortune nearly turned against him. After long marches under the hot sun, Alexander fell ill. Ancient writers suggest it was fever, brought on by exhaustion and perhaps icy waters he drank while overheated. For days he lay weakened, and his army feared for him. Without their king, their purpose might falter. Yet Alexander, stubborn in spirit, endured. He trusted his physician, Philip of Acarnania, who risked suspicion of treachery to give him a daring remedy. The king drank the draught, and though it might have killed a weaker man, Alexander recovered. The army rejoiced, their confidence in him deepened all the more. While Alexander marched through Cilicia, Darius moved his massive host into Syria. Expecting his enemy to remain in the open plains, he advanced northward. But chance and strategy brought them face to face at an unexpected place, near the small river of Issus, in a narrow strip of land hemmed in by sea and mountains. There, the fate of empires would be decided. The plain of Issus was no grand battlefield. It was narrow, pressed between the mountains on one side and the sea on the other, with the small river Pinarus flowing through its center. For Darius, who commanded a force far larger than Alexander's, the terrain was ill-suited. His numbers could not be spread out. His cavalry could not sweep wide in encirclement. Yet there he stood, at the head of a great Persian host, banners flying, chariots prepared, and ranks stretching deep behind him. Alexander's army, though far smaller, was perfectly placed for such ground. His phalanx held the center, long sarissas bristling in steady rows. On the wings, his cavalry waited, poised for the moment to strike. Light troops, archers, slingers, and javelin men hovered at the edges, ready to harass and disrupt. At the head of the right wing, mounted on his horse, stood Alexander himself, his helmet shining, his presence drawing every eye. Before the clash began, Alexander rode along the line, speaking calmly to his men. He reminded them that this was no ordinary battle, but the confrontation they had awaited. Before them stood the great king of Persia himself, with his banners of gold and purple, with his vast retinue of soldiers. Victory here would mean more than land. It would mean the heart of the Persian Empire shaken, its king humbled, its people awed. The Persians struck first, their archers and cavalry advancing across the river. The ground was difficult, the water slowing their charge, but they pressed on. The Macedonian line braced, shields raised, spears leveled. The clash came with a thunder of hooves and the ring of iron. Arrows darkened the air, blades flashed, and cries of men and horses filled the narrow valley. Alexander waited only a moment before launching his decisive move. Leading the companion cavalry, he charged into the river, striking hard at the Persian left. His men followed with fierce momentum, their lances thrusting, their horses driving forward with unstoppable force. The Persians, caught off guard by the sudden fury, wavered. The line bent, then broke, and Alexander pressed deeper, his spear seeking the heart of the enemy. At the center, the phalanx pushed slowly across the stream, their long spears forming a wall of steel. Against them, Persian infantry and Greek mercenaries resisted with desperate strength. The struggle was fierce, but the steady advance of the Macedonian ranks could not be halted. Step by step, the phalanx gained ground, driving the enemy backward. But it was on the right wing, where Alexander fought, that the battle was truly decided. With a daring charge, he aimed directly for the position of Darius himself. The great king, seated high in his chariot, watched as the Macedonian cavalry cut closer. For all his wealth and numbers, the sight of Alexander bearing down upon him filled him with dread. In that moment, Darius chose flight. Abandoning his chariot, he mounted a horse and fled the field. The Persian line, seeing their king retreat, collapsed. Panic spread like fire in dry grass. Soldiers who had fought bravely moments before now turned to run, their formation shattered. The rout was swift and complete. Macedonian cavalry pursued the fleeing enemy, cutting down thousands. The Persian camp, filled with treasure, supplies, and even Darius's family, fell into Alexander's hands. The queen mother, the wife of Darius, and his children were captured, treated by Alexander with courtesy, yet still undeniable symbols of his triumph. By sunset, the plain of Issus belonged to Macedonia. The great king had fled, his army broken, his prestige ruined. Alexander, still only in his early 20s, had stood face to face with the ruler of the mightiest empire on earth, and won. When the dust of battle settled, the plain of Issus was strewn with the remnants of two great armies. The cries of the wounded mingled with the clash of scavengers gathering weapons and armor. The river that had divided the armies now carried with it the memory of a struggle that would echo across ages. The Macedonians, weary but exultant, stood victorious. For them, Issus was more than just another battle. It was proof that their young king could face the mightiest ruler of the world and prevail. Alexander himself, though marked by the strain of combat, shone with the glow of triumph. He had not only beaten a Persian army, but he had struck at the very heart of Persia by routing its king. the Persian losses were staggering. Tens of thousands lay dead or captured, and the wealth of the enemy camp fell into Macedonian hands. But among the spoils were treasures of a different kind. Darius's own family, his mother, his wife, and his daughters had been taken alive, and they now stood before Alexander. The queen mother, Sisigambis, believing she and her family would be shamed or killed, is said to have bowed before Hephaestion, mistaking him for the king because of his noble bearing. When she realized her error, she trembled with fear. But Alexander, rather than punish her, gently reassured her. He placed a hand upon her shoulder and said, "You were not mistaken, for he too is Alexander." With those words, he showed both kindness and loyalty to his dearest companion, while easing the fears of the Persian queen. This bold demand shocked the Persian court. For generations, the great king had been seen as unrivaled, his authority unquestioned. Now a young Macedonian dared to claim his throne. Across the empire, from Babylon to Susa, from Egypt to the distant satrapies, the news spread. The great king had fled, his family captured, his honor stained. In Greece too, the shockwaves were felt. Athens and Sparta, long wary of Macedonian power, now realized resistance was hopeless. If Darius himself could not stop Alexander, how could they? Fear and awe cemented their submission. The victory at Issus was more than military, it was political, symbolic, and psychological. Alexander had proven that the Persians could be beaten, even when their king commanded in person. He had taken not just their soldiers, but their dignity. From this moment on, the campaign was no longer a daring raid into Asia. It was a march toward empire. After Issus, the road eastward into the Persian heartland lay open. Yet Alexander, always calculating, did not rush directly toward Babylon and Susa. He knew that to strike deep into Persia without securing his rear would leave him vulnerable. The coastlines, the ports, and the rich provinces of the south had to be brought under his control. So he turned his march southward, toward Phoenicia and Egypt. These lands were rich, their harbors vital, and their loyalty uncertain. Many of the Phoenician cities, famed for their ships and trade, still recognized Persian authority. If Alexander left them behind, the Persian navy could harass his supply lines and strike at his vulnerable coasts. His first stop was the great city of Tyre, perched on an island just off the coast. Tyre resisted fiercely, refusing him entry. Alexander responded with one of the most remarkable sieges of antiquity. He ordered a massive causeway built across the sea, stone by stone, linking the mainland to the island fortress. Towers were raised, engines pushed forward, and for months the struggle continued. At last, after brutal fighting, Tyre fell. The city was stormed, its defenders cut down, and the message was clear. No fortress, however proud, could stand against Alexander's will. From there he moved south to Gaza, another stubborn stronghold. Again resistance was crushed, though with heavy losses. Each victory tightened Alexander's grip on the region, cutting Persia off from the sea and securing his supply lines. Finally, he marched into Egypt. Here the story was different. The Egyptians, long resentful of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. In Memphis he was crowned pharaoh, embraced as the rightful ruler. He honored their gods, offered sacrifices at their temples, and allowed their traditions to flourish. The priests declared him the son of Ammon, a title that carried divine weight. It was in Egypt, too, that Alexander founded one of his greatest legacies, the city of Alexandria. At the mouth of the Nile, he chose the site with care, envisioning a city that would one day become a center of trade, learning, and culture. Though little more than a plan in his lifetime, Alexandria would endure for centuries as a beacon of Hellenistic civilization. By the time he left Egypt, Alexander's reputation had grown beyond that of a conqueror. He was now seen as a world ruler, blessed by gods both Greek and foreign. His soldiers believed more firmly than ever that destiny guided their march. But even as he looked upon the Nile and the deserts, Alexander's thoughts turned back east. For Darius still lived. The great king, though beaten at Issus, was gathering yet another army, larger, stronger, and more determined than before. The decisive clash still lay ahead, on the vast plains of Mesopotamia. Alexander, now in his mid-20s, prepared himself. He had defeated satraps at the Granicus, humbled Darius at Issus, and been crowned pharaoh in Egypt. Yet his greatest victory, and the true test of his ambition, still waited beyond the horizon. After his triumph in Egypt, Alexander's path led inevitably eastward, into the very heart of the Persian Empire. For all his victories, Persia still stood vast and formidable, and Darius III still sat upon its throne. Though beaten at Issus, the great king had not surrendered. He was determined to gather his strength once more, to crush the Macedonian invader in a final decisive clash. Messengers rode across Persia, carrying Darius's summons to every corner of his empire. From Babylon, Susa, and Ecbatana, supplies and soldiers were gathered. Cavalry from Bactria, archers from the east, war chariots fitted with scythe-like blades, and thousands of infantry were drawn together. By the time the host assembled, it was said to number in the hundreds of thousands, though ancient accounts surely swelled the figures. Even if the truth was less, the Persian army still dwarfed Alexander's. The chosen battlefield was the plain near Gaugamela, a wide and open land in Mesopotamia. Here, Darius believed, his numbers could be brought to full advantage. The fields were cleared and leveled, making room for his cavalry and the deadly scythe chariots. The great king prepared carefully, leaving nothing to chance. Meanwhile, Alexander marched steadily east. From Egypt he moved through Syria, then across the Euphrates and the Tigris. His men endured long marches under the relentless Mesopotamian sun, but their spirits were strong. They had grown used to victory, and more than that, they trusted their king. They had seen him lead from the front, share their hardships, and inspire them with words and deeds alike. On the night before battle, the contrast between the two camps was striking. In the Persian camp, torches blazed in countless rows, fires stretching across the plain like a sea of light. The noise of voices, of horses, of preparation filled the air. In the Macedonian camp, all was calm. Alexander ordered his men to rest, to sleep, and to rise refreshed. When scouts reported the activity in the Persian camp, he only smiled and said, "They light torches because they are many. We rest because we shall win." The stage was set. On the wide plain of Gaugamela, the young king of Macedon would face the great king of Persia for the last and greatest time. The fate of empires rested on what the next day would bring. Dawn broke over the plain of Gaugamela, soft light spilling across a land already prepared for war. The Persians stood in immense ranks, stretching farther than the eye could see. At the center, surrounded by bodyguards and banners, stood Darius in his high chariot, a symbol of royal majesty. Around him were cavalry from every corner of the empire, armored horsemen, archers, and the dreaded scythe chariots, their wheels fitted with sharp blades designed to cut down ranks of infantry. Facing this vast host was Alexander, with perhaps 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, a fraction of the Persian numbers. Yet his army was tightly ordered, trained to perfection, and led by a man whose confidence filled every soldier. The phalanx, long spears bristling, formed the core. On the wings, cavalry waited, ready to strike, and at the far right, where he always placed himself, Alexander prepared to lead the companion cavalry. The battle began with the thunder of chariots. Darius unleashed his scythed vehicles, hoping to smash through the Macedonian lines. The chariots rushed forward, wheels flashing, horses driven hard, but Alexander's men were ready. Trumpets sounded, and the phalanx calmly opened their ranks, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through. As they sped by, light troops swarmed them, cutting down horses and drivers. The terror weapon failed, and the Macedonian line stood firm. Then came the cavalry. Waves of Persian horsemen crashed against Alexander's left, threatening to encircle him. On that wing, the general Parmenion fought desperately to hold them back. The struggle was fierce, dust rising in clouds as horse met horse, lance met lance. For a moment it seemed the Macedonian flank might buckle, but Alexander had seen what he needed. On the Persian left, a gap opened, a weakness in the line. With sudden speed, he seized the moment. Leading the companion cavalry, he angled across the plain, charging straight toward the heart of the Persian position. His lance lowered, his horse straining forward, Alexander drove into the gap with unstoppable force. The impact was tremendous. The Persian line broke under the shock, soldiers scattering before the furious charge. And at the center of it all, Alexander bore down on Darius himself. The great king, seeing the young Macedonian storming toward him, panic in his eyes, turned and fled once more. Abandoning his chariot, he leapt upon a horse and rode from the field. The sight shattered Persian morale. An army of immense size dissolved into confusion as its king vanished. Macedonians pressed forward, cutting down those who resisted, chasing those who fled. The plain became a scene of chaos, dust and cries and clashing steel. On the left, Parmenion still struggled, pressed by Persian cavalry. Alexander, hearing of his danger, turned from pursuit and rode to his aid, rallying his men and driving the enemy back. By day's end, the Persians were in full retreat, their great host shattered. The Battle of Gaugamela was over. Against overwhelming numbers, Alexander had triumphed through discipline, timing, and daring. The Persian Empire, for centuries a giant upon the world stage, had been broken in a single day. The battlefield at Gaugamela was strewn with the remnants of a shattered empire. Broken chariots lay abandoned, horses wandered riderless, and thousands of Persian soldiers lay where they had fallen. The dust of combat settled slowly, and with it came the realization that the course of history had shifted. Darius, once the great king of Persia, had fled eastward, his authority shattered. His men, seeing him abandon the field for a second time, no longer trusted his leadership. The bonds that had tied countless peoples to the Persian throne began to fray. Alexander, meanwhile, stood unchallenged. The victory was not only military, but also symbolic. Against overwhelming numbers, the Macedonian army had prevailed through discipline, precision, and the daring of its young commander. The aura of invincibility that once surrounded Persia now belonged to Alexander. His next steps carried him deeper into the heart of the empire. The gates of Babylon, the fabled city on the Euphrates, opened to him without resistance. As he entered, the people welcomed him as a liberator. Priests brought offerings, nobles bowed low, and processions of music and incense filled the air. The city itself dazzled the Macedonians. Towering walls, broad avenues, and hanging gardens, wonders that seemed almost beyond belief, treasures beyond counting, filled its storehouses. Gold, silver, and the wealth of centuries gathered from across the empire. For the first time, Alexander held in his grasp the riches of Persia itself. Yet he did not plunder recklessly. Instead, he presented himself as the rightful heir of the empire. He honored the Babylonian gods, offered sacrifices at their temples, and treated the people with respect. By doing so, he transformed conquest into acceptance, turning former subjects of Persia into subjects of his own. From Babylon, he moved to Susa, another of Persia's royal cities. Again its gates opened, and again treasures of unimaginable scale were placed in his hands. It was said that the silver and gold seized there filled thousands of pack animals, wealth so vast it seemed to redefine the measure of fortune. But Alexander's ambition was not satisfied with treasure or cities. Darius still lived, retreating eastward, gathering what allies he could. As long as the great king remained, Persia was not fully conquered. And so Alexander pressed on, determined not only to claim Persia's wealth, but to seize its crown. Though Gaugamela had broken Persia's power, Alexander knew the empire was not truly his, while Darius still lived. The great king, though twice defeated, fled eastward, calling upon the loyalty of satraps and nobles in the highlands. If he could rally them, Persia might rise again. Alexander would not allow it. He led his army in relentless pursuit, pressing through rugged terrain, across rivers and mountain passes. At every step he proclaimed himself not merely the destroyer of Persia, but its rightful ruler. Letters were sent to cities and governors, demanding allegiance. Many obeyed, fearful of his victories. Some resisted and were crushed. Step by step, the authority of Darius crumbled. On the way, Alexander seized the greatest prize of all: Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia. Unlike Babylon or Susa, Persepolis resisted, its defenders fighting fiercely. But the Macedonians, seasoned by years of conquest, stormed the city. Its treasures were immense, more gold and silver than the Greeks had ever imagined. The wealth of generations, hoarded in palace vaults, fell into Alexander's hands. Yet what marked Persepolis most was not its riches, but its destruction. After entering the city, Alexander allowed his men to loot, a concession to their long service. Then, in an act both symbolic and controversial, he set fire to the great palace of Xerxes, the king who had once invaded Greece. Flames rose into the night sky, consuming halls adorned with carvings and reliefs. The fire was said to have been lit during a drunken revel, encouraged by courtesans and companions, though some believed it was a deliberate gesture, the final revenge of Greece upon Persia. Whatever the cause, the burning of Persepolis became a symbol. To the Greeks, it was justice for the burning of Athens generations before. To others, it showed the ruthless will of Alexander, who destroyed as well as conquered. As Persepolis smoldered, Darius fled farther east. But his flight grew desperate. Many of his own nobles, weary of defeat and fearful of Alexander's advance, began to abandon him. In time, betrayal came. Darius was taken prisoner by his own satraps, left weakened and wounded. When Alexander finally drew near, he found the great king dying on the roadside, deserted by those who had once sworn loyalty. Alexander is said to have mourned his fallen rival. He cast his cloak over Darius's body, honoring him with a king's burial. In that act, he declared himself not only the conqueror of Persia, but the heir to its throne. With Darius dead and the royal capitals of Persia in his hands, Alexander had achieved what once seemed impossible. The empire of Cyrus and Xerxes, which had stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, now belonged to a Macedonian king, barely in his late 20s. Yet for Alexander, conquest was never an end, only a beginning. The fall of Persia did not satisfy him, it only opened new horizons. His gaze turned still farther east, toward lands beyond even Persia's reach. With the death of Darius and the fall of Persepolis, Alexander might have turned back west, content with riches and a throne. Many of his men hoped he would. They had marched for years, crossed continents, and now stood as masters of the greatest empire the world had known. To return home in triumph would have been glory enough. But Alexander was not a man to rest upon what was already won. For him, conquest was a horizon. Each time he reached it, he looked beyond. Persia was no longer enough. His thoughts turned farther east, to lands where even the great kings had not ruled completely. Central Asia, with its mountains, deserts and fierce tribes, awaited him. And beyond that, India, the mysterious land of rivers and elephants, whispered promises of new challenges. The march into these regions was unlike the battles of Greece or Mesopotamia. Here Alexander faced no great empire with ordered armies. Instead, he met resistance in the form of scattered tribes, sudden uprisings, and guerrilla warfare in harsh landscapes. The terrain itself was as much an enemy as the people. Northward he went, through the land of Bactria and Sogdiana. The rivers ran swift and cold, the mountains towered snow-capped above him, and the plains stretched wide and empty. His army endured bitter winters, scorching summers, and endless marches. At every step, bands of warriors harried his forces, striking and vanishing into the hills. Villages resisted stubbornly, fortified strongholds clung to cliffs, and rebellions flared whenever his army moved on. Yet Alexander pressed forward. He built new cities, planting garrisons to hold the land. Some bore his own name, Alexandria's, markers of his claim upon the world. He married diplomacy to war, forging alliances with some tribes, while crushing others. Each victory was smaller than Gaugamela or Issus, yet together they formed a chain of conquest that bound Central Asia to his rule. It was during these years that Alexander also began to adopt new customs. He wore Persian dress at times, sat upon the royal throne, and demanded forms of respect that echoed Eastern traditions. To his Macedonian companions, this was unsettling. They had followed him as a general, but now they saw him becoming something more, or perhaps something less familiar. Whispers spread of a king who sought not only to rule Persians, but to become one of them. Still, his ambition was unshaken. Central Asia, though difficult, was not his final goal. Each fortress taken, each rebellion subdued, was but another step toward a farther horizon. For beyond the mountains and rivers lay India, rich in legend, vast and unknown, and Alexander, restless as ever, longed to set his eyes upon it. The lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, lying beyond the Oxus River and stretching toward the steppes, tested Alexander's army more than any battle with Persia ever had. Unlike the wide plains where phalanxes could march in order, these regions were broken by mountains, rivers and fortresses perched high upon cliffs. Enemies did not face him in open battle, but struck suddenly, vanishing into the landscape. It was a war of endurance, of sieges, of endless pursuit. When Alexander first crossed into Bactria, he found himself among a proud and independent people. Persian rule had touched these lands lightly, and the tribes were quick to rise against any foreign conqueror. Alexander advanced methodically, storming strongholds one by one, yet each time he believed the region subdued, new uprisings flared behind him. In Sogdiana, resistance grew even fiercer. The people fought with stubborn courage, retreating to remote fortresses carved into the rocks. One such place, the Sogdian Rock, was said to be impregnable, standing high on a cliff with sheer walls all around. When Alexander demanded its surrender, the defenders mocked him, declaring that only men with wings could scale such heights. Alexander, never one to yield to defiance, turned the taunt into challenge. He called for volunteers, and among his soldiers were men skilled in climbing. Using iron tent pegs and ropes, they scaled the cliff by night, clinging to the rock face with hands numbed by cold. By morning, a small band of Macedonians appeared above the fortress, waving their shields. The defenders, stunned by the sight, surrendered without further fight. Stories like this spread through the land, building Alexander's reputation not only as a conqueror, but as a man who could achieve the impossible. Fear began to work where swords had failed. Still, the campaigns dragged on for years. Harsh winters bit at the soldiers, scorching summers drained their strength, supply lines stretched thin, rebellions kept breaking out, and the unfamiliar terrain tested even the hardiest veterans. Morale wavered at times, but Alexander's presence, his tireless energy, and his willingness to share their hardships kept the army moving. It was in these regions, too, that Alexander's path grew more personal. He met Roxana, the daughter of a local noble, said to be strikingly beautiful. Their marriage, celebrated among his companions, was more than romance. It was a gesture of unity, binding Macedonian conqueror and Central Asian people. It symbolized Alexander's vision of blending East and West, forging a new order that was not merely Greek, nor merely Persian, but something larger. Yet even as he built alliances, he demanded obedience. Rebellious leaders were hunted down without mercy. Some were executed, others forced into submission. The message was clear: resistance would be crushed, loyalty rewarded. By the time Alexander was finished, Bactria and Sogdiana were not peaceful, but they were under his hand. Fortresses were garrisoned, new cities founded, roads secured. The army, weary but victorious, stood once more at the edge of the known world. And beyond, across the mighty Indus and its tributaries, lay India, a land of elephants, rivers, and kingdoms unlike any they had ever seen. When the last fortresses of Sogdiana had fallen, and the rebellions were subdued, Alexander turned his gaze once more toward the horizon. His men, exhausted and longing for home, hoped the years of relentless conquest might be ending. But Alexander's ambition was endless. He spoke now of India, a land of wonder spoken of in Greek tales, of mighty rivers wider than seas, of warriors who fought with elephants, of treasures and wisdom unknown to the West. The march began across the Hindu Kush, a range of mountains as forbidding as any Alexander had yet crossed. Snow capped the peaks, icy winds howled through the passes, and narrow paths clung to the mountainsides. The soldiers, hardened by years of campaigning, struggled with frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion. Pack animals stumbled and died, their loads left behind. Yet still, the king pressed onward, riding at the front, urging his men through hardships that seemed unending. At last, they descended into the lands, watered by the Indus and its tributaries. Here the air grew warmer, the earth greener, and the people different in language and custom. Cities dotted the plains, each ruled by its own king or chief. Some submitted willingly, offering tribute to the foreign conqueror. Others resisted, raising armies to block his advance. Alexander fought them as he had fought all before, swiftly, decisively, relentlessly. Fortresses were stormed, defenders cut down or pardoned, depending on their defiance. Elephants, strange and massive beasts, appeared on the battlefield, shaking the courage of some, but stirring Alexander's fascination. He studied their use, learning how they might be faced in combat. The campaign in India was unlike the battles of Greece or Persia. The land itself was vast and strange, with rivers that seemed to flow endlessly, forests thick with life, and monsoon rains that drenched the army in sudden torrents. Yet Alexander moved with the same determination as ever, adapting to each new challenge, pressing ever eastward. Among those who submitted was the ruler of Taxila, a wealthy city at the crossroads of trade. He welcomed Alexander with gifts and hospitality, offering alliance instead of resistance. From here, Alexander prepared to march farther, toward the Hydaspes River, where one of the most famous encounters of his campaigns awaited him. For there, standing in his path, was a king named Porus, tall, proud, and commanding an army unlike any Alexander had faced before, with elephants at its heart. The Hydaspes River, swollen by rain and spring melt, ran deep and swift across Alexander's path. On the far bank stood King Porus, ruler of a powerful Indian kingdom. He was said to be a giant of a man, tall and commanding, his presence as imposing as the elephants that formed the heart of his army. Porus had gathered his warriors, cavalry, chariots, and more than 200 war elephants, beasts that loomed like living towers, their tusks tipped with iron, their backs carrying armed men. For Alexander's soldiers the sight was daunting. They had faced cavalry charges and Persian chariots, but never creatures of such size and power. The elephants bellowed, stamping the ground, their trunks tossing chains and weapons. To fight them meant not only facing men but the fury of beasts unlike anything the Macedonians had known. Alexander studied the scene with calm determination. He knew a direct crossing would be impossible. The river's current was too strong, and Porus's army waited in full strength to strike. So, with characteristic cunning, he devised a plan. By night, under cover of storms and darkness, Alexander led a portion of his army upstream. They crossed the river in silence, using boats and improvised rafts, some men even swimming alongside their horses. The crossing was perilous, but the gamble succeeded. When dawn broke, Alexander stood on the far bank with his cavalry and a strong force of infantry, ready to surprise the enemy. Porus reacted quickly, bringing his army forward to meet the intruders. The battle that followed was fierce and unlike any Alexander had fought before. The elephants advanced first, trampling forward, their tusks striking, their riders hurling javelins from above. Macedonian horses shied at the sight and smell of the beasts, while soldiers struggled against their sheer bulk. Some elephants crashed through the lines, scattering men and crushing them beneath their feet. Yet Alexander's discipline held. He ordered his archers and light troops to focus their fire on the elephants and their riders. Arrows pierced eyes, javelins struck vulnerable spots, and the beasts grew panicked, turning in confusion against their own lines. The phalanx, steady and unbroken, pressed forward, spears leveled against the towering animals. Meanwhile, Alexander himself led the cavalry against Porus's flanks. He struck swiftly, circling and cutting, never allowing the enemy to settle. Again and again, he drove into weak points, his companions following with relentless force. Slowly, the Indian line began to give way. The struggle lasted for hours, the field a chaos of men, horses and elephants. At last, Porus, wounded but unyielding, stood surrounded. When he was finally captured, he was brought before Alexander. The young king asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus, proud even in defeat, replied, "Like a king." Alexander, moved by his courage, honored the request. Rather than strip him of his rule, he restored him as satrap, granting him greater lands than before. The victory at the Anabasis was one of Alexander's most remarkable. It showed not only his skill in battle, but also his ability to honor bravery, even in an enemy. His men, however, felt differently. The endless marches, the strange lands, and the ferocity of the Indian armies had worn them down. For the first time, murmurs spread in the camp that perhaps they had marched far enough. Alexander had reached the edge of the known world, and even he would soon learn that not all horizons could be crossed. After the hard-fought victory at the Anabasis, Alexander stood triumphant on the banks of the great river. He had defeated King Porus, secured alliances with Indian rulers, and shown once again that no army could stand against his will. Yet for all his victories, his greatest challenge was not ahead of him, but behind. Within his own camp, the Macedonian soldiers, hardened by years of conquest, had reached their limit. They had marched from Greece through Asia Minor, across Mesopotamia, into Persia, through the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, and now to the distant plains of India. They had fought countless battles, endured endless marches, and left their homes behind for nearly a decade. When Alexander spoke of pushing farther east, beyond even the Ganges, his men murmured in defiance. They had heard tales of kingdoms greater still, of rivers wider than seas, of armies and elephants beyond imagining. To Alexander, these stories were invitations, horizons to be crossed. To his men, they were warnings, proof that their journey might never end. At last, at the Anabasis River, the army refused to march farther. The officers, loyal yet weary, came before Alexander and begged him to turn back. They spoke of homes unseen for years, of families left behind, of bodies broken by endless hardship. Even the most devoted companions could not find the strength to follow him further. For the first time, Alexander faced resistance not from an enemy, but from his own army. He tried to persuade them, reminding them of their victories, promising them new riches, urging them to follow him into lands that no Greek had ever seen. But the silence that met his words was heavier than any enemy force. His men stood firm. At last Alexander relented. He declared that if they would not march farther, then they would return, but not in defeat. Instead, he promised, they would march back as conquerors, carrying the glory of their victories with them. He turned away from the uncharted east, but in doing so, he prepared for a new journey that would prove as deadly as any battle, the long return through deserts and hardship. The edge of the world had been reached. Now began the march home. When Alexander turned back from the Anabasis, he did not choose the quickest road home. Instead, he resolved to explore and conquer as he went, tracing the rivers of India toward the sea. To him, the return was not an end, but another chapter in discovery and conquest. The army followed the Indus, moving through fertile valleys and fortified towns. Some rulers submitted willingly, offering gifts and tribute. Others resisted, forcing the Macedonians into bitter sieges. One of the most stubborn cities was Multan. The defenders resisted fiercely, forcing Alexander to lead the assault himself. Scaling the walls under a hail of arrows, he was struck by a missile that pierced his armor and entered his chest. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The great conqueror, who had faced countless dangers, now lay bleeding, carried from the walls by his men. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he was dead, others that he was dying. In the camp, despair and unrest grew. Without their king, the long march home might collapse into chaos. But Alexander, even in weakness, refused to yield. Against the advice of his physicians, he allowed himself to be seen by the soldiers. Carried out on a litter, pale but alive, he raised his hand in greeting. The sight of him breathing, still defiant, lifted the spirits of the army. They cheered, renewed in their loyalty, though they begged him to take greater care. Once recovered, he pressed on, determined to see the river's end. Step by step, The army descended the Indus, meeting resistance from tribes along the way. Battles were fought on riverbanks, in dense forests, and at city walls. Yet each victory came at a cost, draining the strength of men already weary. At last, after months of struggle, Alexander's forces reached the delta of the Indus, where the river spread into many channels before meeting the sea. For the first time, the Macedonian king gazed upon the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. To him, it was another horizon, proof that the world was wider still. He offered sacrifices to the gods, thanking them for bringing him so far, and prayed for safe passage as his journey turned westward at last. But the hardest trial still lay ahead. To return to Persia, Alexander chose a road that would test his men more cruelly than any battle, the march across the Gadrosian desert. From the Indus, Alexander divided his forces. Part of the army was sent by sea under the admiral Granicus, tasked with charting the unknown coastlines and securing supplies. Alexander himself, however, chose the harder road. He would lead the bulk of the army overland, through the Gadrosian desert, a barren expanse of sand and stone that stretched for hundreds of miles along the coast of modern-day southern Iran. The decision was bold, some said reckless. The Gadrosian desert was feared even by local peoples, who avoided it except in the mildest seasons. Its sands burned in the day under relentless sun, and its nights chilled the bones with cold winds. Water was scarce, food scarcer still. Yet Alexander chose this path, perhaps to outdo the feats of earlier conquerors, perhaps to test himself and his men one last time. The march began with determination. Lines of soldiers stretched across the sand, their armor glinting, their banners fluttering weakly in the hot wind. Pack animals carried supplies, but the weight of thirst grew heavier with each passing day. Springs were few, often dried to dust. Men dug in the sand in desperate search of water, sometimes finding only bitter brine. As the days wore on, the hardships deepened. Heat shimmered across the dunes, disorienting the soldiers. Food ran short, animals perished, their bodies left behind as grim markers along the trail. Many men collapsed from exhaustion, their comrades carrying them as far as they could before the desert claimed them. One story tells of a group of scouts who returned with a helmet filled with water, the last they could find. They carried it to Alexander, offering it as a precious gift. The king looked at the water, then at his men, parched and weary. Without drinking, he poured it into the sand before them. "If my soldiers cannot drink," he said, "then neither will I." The gesture stirred the army, giving them strength to endure, though it did nothing to quench their thirst. The march through the Gadrosian desert lasted weeks, each day a trial of survival. When at last they emerged, countless lives had been lost. The army was thinner, weaker, but alive, and their loyalty to Alexander, forged through shared suffering, was deeper than ever. To others, the march seemed madness. To Alexander, it was proof that no obstacle, however cruel, could halt his will. He had conquered mountains, rivers, empires, and now even the desert itself. Yet the price of this triumph was written in the countless graves left behind in the shifting sands. When at last the weary army staggered out of the Gadrosian desert, the land of Persia lay before them once more. The men, gaunt from hunger and thirst, their numbers reduced, carried with them the memory of suffering that few armies in history had endured. Yet they were alive, and in their survival was a kind of triumph. Alexander received word that Granicus had succeeded in bringing the fleet safely along the coast. The reunion of land and sea forces was a moment of celebration, proof that even in the harshest trials, his plans had endured. The desert had not broken him, nor his men. As he marched inland, cities opened their gates to him, their people bowing to the conqueror, who now returned, not as invader, but as ruler. In Persepolis, in Susa, in Babylon, he was greeted with ceremony and reverence. Processions filled the streets, priests offered sacrifices, and treasures once gathered by Darius and Xerxes now lay firmly under his control. But Alexander had changed. The years of conquest, the endless horizons, and the harsh passage through India and the desert had left their mark. He began to take on more openly the customs of Persia, wearing royal robes, demanding prostration from courtiers, and blending Macedonian and Eastern traditions. To some, this was wisdom, a way to unify a vast and diverse empire. To others, especially his Macedonian companions, it was troubling. Whispers grew that their king was no longer the man who had marched out of Greece, but something new, something less familiar. Still, his authority was absolute. He distributed rewards to his men, rebuilding their strength and honoring their endurance. New cities were founded, roads repaired, and administration tightened. From the mountains of Bactria to the valleys of the Nile, from the deserts of Persia to the plains of India, the world now bent to his rule. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Distance strained the empire. Local revolts flared, jealousies grew among his generals, and the sheer scale of his dominion made it fragile. Alexander had returned as a conqueror, but the task of ruling what he had taken would test him in ways no battlefield ever had. For now, however, the army rejoiced in survival. They had seen the edge of the world and lived to tell of it. They had marched through deserts, crossed rivers, and followed their king farther than any soldiers before them. The return to Persia was not the end of their trials, but it was a moment of rest, a pause before the final chapters of Alexander's extraordinary life. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon, he was no longer simply the king of Macedon. He was ruler of an empire stretching from Greece to Egypt, from Persia to India, the largest the world had yet seen. Yet though his conquest seemed complete, Alexander himself remained restless. In Babylon, he was received with splendor, processions filled the streets, offerings poured into his hands, and emissaries from distant lands came to bow before him. Tributes arrived from Greece, Africa, and beyond. For many, he was not merely a king, but a figure touched by the divine, a man whose will seemed unstoppable. But Alexander's mind was never satisfied with what he had. Even as he presided over ceremonies, he spoke of new campaigns. He dreamed of pushing westward to Carthage, of sailing into Arabia, of exploring the edges of the earth. To his companions, weary from years of marching, these visions seemed endless, as though their king's hunger for horizons could never be filled. The man himself had changed. He wore Persian robes as often as Macedonian armor, sat upon golden thrones, and accepted honors once reserved for the great kings of Persia. At banquets he demanded that courtiers perform proskynesis, prostration before him, a gesture that troubled many of his old companions, who still remembered him as the boy who had once ridden with them in simple cloak and helmet. Yet despite the outward splendor, Alexander's body bore the marks of his relentless life. Years of campaigning had left scars upon him. Wounds from arrows, blades, and sieges lingered. The long march through India and the Gedrosian desert had drained his strength. He was still young, not yet 33, but the weight of endless conquest pressed heavily upon him. In Babylon, the signs of strain grew clearer. Fevers gripped him, exhaustion weighed him down, and moments of weakness broke through his usual energy. Still he pressed on, planning new expeditions, directing the building of ships, and discussing visions of lands yet unconquered. He had reached the height of earthly power, but even Alexander could not conquer time, nor the frailty of the human body. The end, though unseen, was drawing near. It was in the great city of Babylon, amid plans for new campaigns and festivals of triumph, that Alexander's health began to falter. The exact cause has remained a mystery through the centuries. Ancient writers spoke of fever, of exhaustion, of wounds that never fully healed. Some whispered of poison, others of a body simply worn down by years of relentless struggle. At first it was only fatigue. After a banquet with his companions, he complained of pain and weariness. Yet as the days passed, the fever grew stronger. He was carried from his bed to perform sacrifices to the gods, but his strength wavered. Soon he could no longer rise. The man who had once led charges across rivers and deserts now lay motionless, his body burning with illness. His generals gathered anxiously. They had followed him through mountains and across seas, but now they faced a fear greater than any battle, the thought of losing him. The empire they had carved together stretched too wide, held together only by his will. Without Alexander, what would become of it? Day after day, the fever worsened. He lost his voice, then his ability to stand. The companions who visited his bedside wept openly, for the sight of their king, once so strong, reduced to frailty, was unbearable. Some prayed, others begged the gods for mercy, but the sickness did not lift. Despite his weakness, Alexander tried to remain a leader to the very end. He continued to give orders, carried out on the lips of scribes. He asked after his army, after the fleet, after the plans for Arabia. His mind, if not his body, still reached outward to horizons unseen. The soldiers, hearing of his decline, demanded to see him. They crowded into the palace courtyard, filling the halls with their cries. Though barely able to move, Alexander insisted they be admitted. Propped upon his bed, too weak to speak, he raised his hand in silent greeting. The men filed past, thousands of them, each one taking comfort in that final gesture, their king still watching over them, still acknowledging their loyalty. It was the last time they would see him alive. As the fever tightened its grip, those closest to Alexander knew the end was near. The palace in Babylon, once filled with the noise of planning and celebration, grew hushed, its halls shadowed by grief. Companions, generals, and family members gathered at his bedside, unwilling to leave him even for a moment. In these final hours, Alexander's thoughts turned not only to his own fate, but to the vast empire he had forged. His generals, anxious and divided, pressed him with a question that burned in every heart: who would succeed him? The sources differ on what he said. Some claimed he whispered that his empire should go to the strongest, a command that sowed seeds of rivalry. Others said he handed his signet ring to Perdiccas, one of his trusted officers, as a sign of succession. Still others believed he left no clear answer at all, for who could truly inherit the will of Alexander? What is certain is that his companions leaned close, straining to catch his final words. His voice was faint, his body weak, but his eyes still burned with the fire that had carried him from Pella to the ends of the earth. The soldiers, too, were given a farewell. Though he could not speak, Alexander raised his hand in silent blessing as they passed his bed. For men who had followed him through deserts, across rivers, and into the heart of Persia, that simple gesture carried more weight than any speech. It was a final bond between king and army, sealed in silence. In the quiet that followed, Alexander slipped away. He was only 32 years old, yet he had lived more than most could imagine in many lifetimes. His body was mortal, but his legend had already taken root in every land he had touched. The companions who stood around his bed wept openly. Some tore their clothes, others clung to one another in despair. The conqueror of the world was gone, and with him went the single thread that held their vast empire together. The question of succession would ignite years of conflict, but in that moment, all that mattered was loss. The king who had crossed continents, who had dreamed of horizons beyond horizons, now lay still, his journey ended. When news of Alexander's death spread through Babylon, the city fell into mourning. Soldiers who had marched with him from Greece wept like children. Nobles and satraps, uncertain of their future, whispered anxiously in the palace halls. Even those who had once resisted him felt the weight of his passing, for they knew they had lived in the shadow of a man unlike any other. The question of succession tore at the empire immediately. Alexander had left no clear heir. His wife Roxana was with child, but the boy, later known as Alexander IV, was yet unborn. His half-brother Aridius was alive but weak in mind. Around these fragile claims the generals circled like wolves. The empire, vast and rich, became the prize of those who had once served together. What followed were the wars of the successors, decades of conflict in which Alexander's empire fractured into pieces. Macedonia, Egypt, and Asia were divided among his commanders. Each claimed to be the true guardian of his legacy, yet none could hold the empire whole. The unity forged by one man dissolved into rivalry and war. And yet, though the empire splintered, the memory of Alexander did not fade. His cities, the many Alexandrias he founded, became centers of trade, culture, and learning. His conquests spread Greek ideas and language across vast regions, blending with local traditions to create what historians call the Hellenistic world. In these lands, art, science, and philosophy flourished, carried on currents that began with his march. Legends surrounded his name. To some, he was a hero, a new Achilles whose courage carried him beyond the limits of men. To others, he was a warning, a man consumed by ambition who reached for godhood and fell to mortality. Stories of his deeds spread far beyond the lands he conquered, reaching as far as Rome, India, and later even medieval Europe. His name became a symbol of greatness, both admired and feared. Alexander had lived only 32 years. In that short span, he had crossed deserts, climbed mountains, founded cities, and overthrown the mightiest empire of his age. He had seen more of the world than any of his companions, and he had refused to rest until his body itself gave way. In the end, his greatest conquest was not land or treasure, but memory. For more than 2,000 years, his story has been told and retold, not only as history but as legend. The boy from Macedonia, tutored by Aristotle, crowned at 20, who crossed the world with sword and vision, remains one of the most enduring figures of human history. And though his empire crumbled, his name endures, Alexander the Great. And so, the life of Alexander comes to its quiet close. From the palaces of Pella to the banks of the Hydaspes, from the deserts of Persia to the great halls of Babylon, he left his mark upon every horizon he touched. His years were few, but his story endures across centuries, carried in the whispers of history and the pages of legend. As you rest now, let the noise of battles fade into silence. Let the clash of spears and the roar of armies dissolve into calm, like ripples fading across a still river. The rise and fall of empires has passed, yet the memory of Alexander remains, not in the dust of war, but in the quiet wonder of a life lived at the edge of possibility. May these stories bring you peace, and may the dreams of distant ages carry you gently into sleep. Good night.